and then take this on your phone and drive 25 miles around Kansas City, looking at present day Kansas City through the eyes of the past and trying to understand how we got here. So I want to talk a little bit about that history, how the tour came to be, and then also hopefully give some space for us to do some work to think about how those things relate to us personally, and then to think about what we can do going forward. So I hope this time is interesting and helpful and challenging. I'm going to share some slides as we go through. Which I should just say, like my slide ethic is like boring TED slides. It's just like a picture and then I'll talk over it. So hopefully that's okay. But this way you just have something to look at besides me if you want to. Can you see my slides? Is that working?
Yeah,
okay.
We're good.
Okay, great. Thanks a lot. So the story of Dividing Lines starts here. I don't know if anyone recognizes this. I don't know if anyone has been here anytime recently because of COVID. This is Harry's, and Dividing Lines started at Harry's. I had a podcast at the time, and it was about the past and present of equality in education. And like many podcasters, you put in a lot of work and a lot of effort and don't necessarily get a lot of people listening. So I had this idea that I thought would just blow up my podcast, and that was that author Tanner Colby was coming to Kansas City to speak to a group of students through the Johnson County Library's Race Project KC, and because he was an author and because his book had made a little bit of a stir in Kansas City, his book "Some of My Best Friends Are Black," I thought, man, if I can get Tanner Colby on my podcast, then it'll blow up and it'll be great, and I'll be able to make money on it instead of just dwindling away my time and resources. As it happened, however, his flight got delayed, and I was sitting at that back table all the way at the back of the room, just looking very sad and despondent because he didn't show up. But the people who had arranged the meeting were two wonderful librarians from the Johnson County Library. And as a sort of consolation, we're like, well, let's all get a drink anyway. And who knew what that would lead to? As it turned out, I'd been doing a little bit of audio tour work at the Nelson Atkins Museum, and they had heard about that. That plus my interest in race and equity turned out to be a really beautiful opportunity. Race Project KC, for about 2 years at that time, had been getting together a group of about 7 different schools and annually taking them on a tour of the history of segregation in Kansas City. And these 2 librarians, Angel Tucker and Mary Shortino, said, hey, what if we take that experience and expand it so other people can do it? I was so thrilled. It felt like the opportunity of a lifetime. It felt like so incredibly serendipitous and so much better than getting to meet Tanner Colby, which I did get to meet him later and whatnot, but he wasn't on the podcast, and that's totally fine, neither here nor there. So wonderful memory of Harry's back in times when it was easier to go out. At the time, I thought I had produced 2 documentary series on how race and immigration affect people's access to opportunity. So I felt like to do this tour was going to be sort of right in my wheelhouse, and I felt a measure of even as a white man experience with the idea of racism and the history of the country. But I learned as I went a really important lesson that I think I've really tried to lean into now, and that's that there's always more to learn. And then in fact, I'm going to be unlearning the sort of miseducation that I have for the rest of my life. And that came through the production of Dividing Lines when I did interviews with people. I wanted it to be an experience where people, where you heard first-person perspectives of the tour. So I talked to a reporter who had covered blockbusting in the 70s, Bill Tammeus for the Kansas City Star. I talked to Mamie Hughes, for whom one of the overpasses over Highway 71 is named. She was an ombudsman liaising between the city, the federal government, and individuals during the construction, during the long construction of Highway 71. I talked to Margaret May, the neighborhood, the director of the neighborhood council at that time for Ivanhoe. And some of the things that really stuck out to me, the lessons that really stuck out to me was that I had looked back at 1954 Brown v. Board of Segregation, or Brown v. Board of Topeka, which presumably ended segregation in schools, or made segregation in schools illegal, as a big win for all Americans. But what I learned was that Brown v. Board was implemented in such a way that actually broke up Black communities and hurt people. I also learned, again, going back to 71, it hadn't occurred to me that Highway 71 goes through a part of the city that used to be houses, that used to be people's homes. So the process of invoking an eminent domain to acquire that land for the city, for the Highway Commission, was not a pretty process. Because it was such a long process. Like I said, it took 50 years between the first property acquisitions to the actual completion of the highway. And it led to a lot of vacancies, which invited crime to the area. So that was another lesson that I learned in the process that just kind of blew my mind of realizing that the way things are happened sort of intentionally, and that there was sort of more meaning than what I would have at first thought. But then I went to talk to Sid Willens. Sid Willens was an activist and a sort of civil rights lawyer, really wonderful Kansas City, and he actually passed away just a month after the tour was finished. And in a way, I think of the tour as being a sort of ode to him. Okay, sorry, I was taking a moment to look in the chat. So I went to Sid's house. So this was back in 2018 when I was producing the tour. And Sid lived in Leawood at the time. And I just got to tell you the story about what it was like with him, because it was so, I don't know, incredibly memorable. Sid, I walk in his front door, and about as soon as he opens the door, he's telling me, okay, come on, let's go. We gotta tell you this story. Like, you've got to document this. And he's frantic. And this is a 90-something-year-old man, lived a full life, but as energetic as ever. And I can't, frantic is the right word, that he was just had a sense of urgency of, you've got to tell this story. And when I interview people with a microphone, I feel like I kind of zoom out and time just stops. And I remember leaving that interview with all of his franticness and his really urgent excitement and intentionality about the interview, and just feeling like, did I get anything? Was he just kind of a cuckoo old man at this point? And I then remember going home and listening to the tape and realizing that his story would become the bedrock of the tour, the sort of through line that would weave throughout the whole tour. And I think the lesson that he taught me in Dividing Lines was maybe the most important of all. And it really is what I hope people take away from Dividing Lines. Like I said, Sid Willens was a civil rights lawyer. He was an activist. He fought time and time again for the people, not for his own financial gain, but because he wanted to do good and be good for the community. And yet, he told me a story about how he had accidentally been funding homes on the east side of Kansas City that were being bought up and sold to Black families in a move to bust blocks for block busting. For him, he was working through a good personal friend of his who he had done business with for many years. They were looking for investment opportunities. there was nothing inherently bad about just seeking a good investment. That's fine. But the story that he was telling me was how he had accidentally done something that he felt really poorly about. And that when he learned what happened, it caused him to take action. So the trouble with racism now, and the trouble with the way that our cities are built, is that simply by carrying out good business, simply by existing and trying to live our lives, if we aren't intentional, we will sort of accidentally perpetuate systems of inequality. Back at the very beginning of the 20th century, Kansas City was integrated. There wasn't such a thing as segregated neighborhoods in Kansas City. But there were three state and private mechanisms which served to segregate our communities in a really lasting way. The first of those was residential security maps, and that's what you're looking at here. We refer to this as redlining. So the red neighborhoods were neighborhoods that the Homeowners Loan Corporation back in the 30s referred to as risky places to lend, or they didn't recommend that banks lend in those neighborhoods. Almost all the time, these neighborhoods that were redlined were Black neighborhoods. The yellow neighborhoods were integrated neighborhoods. And the green neighborhoods were neighborhoods that were white or that had racially restrictive covenants in the deeds to ensure that they would stay white. Prairie Village in the 1940s is sort of a prime example of what this meant. Prairie Village, built in the 1940s, was sort of built by J.C. Nichols as a place that was intended for GIs coming back from World War II to be able to buy houses for cheap. And you could get a home in Prairie Village for as little as $4,000. If you were a recipient of the GI Bill, you could have a zero down payment or very low down payment, and then a very low interest mortgage. Less than 0.5% of all GI Bill recipients were Black. That means that white people were able to take advantage of this amazing investment product. Homes now in Prairie Village average at $300,000. So it's an amazing amount of wealth accumulation that has occurred for those people that bought homes there new and passed them down to the children who are still living. And Black people were entirely kept out of that. And that's one of the foundations of the racial wealth gap, which exists to this day, where Black households on average have 1/10 of the average wealth of white households. So these things we can't, they exist around us, and if we're not privy to them, it's easy to think that they happen by chance, and to sort of impute characteristics of onto actual people. In a video that I did with a professor at K-State, one of the things that we said was that when our neighborhoods are so segregated, and when you can drive through those neighborhoods and see such a difference in how the condition of the houses and the streets and the sidewalks, when they're so segregated by race, it's easy to then impute the adjectives that we would use for the neighborhoods also to people, which is a horrible thing. But it's something that if we aren't cautious, it's so incredibly easy for us to do. Going forward a little bit into the 70s and 80s, 60s and 70s, and the first half of the 80s, blockbusting happened across Kansas City. And that was what Sid's story was about, that I was referring to. And blockbusting was when an all white neighborhood, maybe a house would become vacant, and a real estate speculator might buy up a home and then move a Black family into that home. The housing stock for Black families in Kansas City and across the country has almost always been restrictively low. So when a house became open, Black families who could afford it were excited to move out of cramped living conditions. But speculating real estaters or real estate folks would move a Black family onto a white block and then sort of prey on racial animus to scare the white people away, to incite white flight. That's sort of what ended up playing into the truce divide that exists today. It was a combination of blockbusting practices and the school district, which would move the boundary lines for schools each year to accommodate blockbusting and to keep schools segregated. Okay, so that was a lot of history that I was trying to speak to really quickly, because I really want to get to this next part, which is us to sort of think about this together. So I hope that I gave enough of a history, or that maybe some of you have taken the tour, so that we can think about this question together. If we can, I want to do a quick breakout here. So let's say we do about 7 minutes. And I think it's really important for us to think about how the history of redlining, racial restrictive housing covenants, and blockbusting intersect with you in your life. Could be where you grew up. It could be where you live now. So I want us to do a quick breakout and talk about this with the people in our breakout room real quick. Can we do that? Okay, cool. All right, I hope that was some good discussion for everyone. I hope that was clear. Again, the goal there was with these breakout kind of discussions and things is to take this history and figure out how it relates to you and how it intersects with your life. So I think that's a really big part of trying to make a change. My notes died here. So we tried to capture the history of the history of segregation in Kansas City in dividing lines. I'm sorry, I'm looking for my place on my notes. We tried to capture this history in dividing lines with the hope that people would see themselves in the story, and then they would be able to take action into the future. So they would see that unfortunately, like everybody plays a part in perpetuating an unequal system. We can do so accidentally, we can do so completely without our knowing, but I think one of the ways to start to make a change is to see ourselves in that story. So that brings us up to this summer, which was both deeply painful and also at times somewhat heartening. Doing the work of trying to do sort of anti-racist education, to fight for racial justice, it was really exciting to see the protests, in my opinion, to see the peaceful protests, to see people clamoring for change, and to see a lot of people clamoring for change, especially a lot of white people clamoring for change who hadn't spoken up before. The interesting thing about speaking up is that it's great in that it maybe builds a sort of collective momentum towards change, but a Facebook like isn't the same as action. And there's sort of two tiers of action that I really want to talk about that we can do to make a change. So I have two streams here. We're in metaphor land of two streams. So one of those changes is at the heart level. When we work to educate ourselves, to be aware, like I had to be aware when I became aware when I was creating dividing lines, that we will always be on our own journey of learning and rediscovering and unlearning sometimes. There's that level of sort of heart change, internal work that has to happen. And then this other stream is policy change that we can be a part of through a couple different avenues. They're both equally important. The one, that internal work means creating a world where microaggressions happen less, where people of color are less reminded that they are not white, that they are more safe from the little aggressions that might happen by us, them mentality or languaging. And the policy change is what will create, hopefully, a lasting, hopefully create a world that is where everyone truly has the opportunity to live their life to the fullest, and the same opportunity for that as a white male like myself. So I want to talk about some specific things. I got ahead of myself there. So in a minute, I want to talk about some specific things that you can do. But I know you all are civically engaged. You're engaged in volunteering and things like that. And I imagine that in the past several months, you may have experienced something or learned something that was totally new to you. I definitely know that I have. I try to make a point of even calling it out to my friends, to my wife, like, hey, like I learned this new thing, like, because I think it's really important to keep that posture of continuously learning and growing and revising how we understand the world around us. So I want to do another breakout session. We're doing 2 more breakout sessions here we're going to talk sort of about each stream in these two. So first, we're talking about that internal work that is part of doing racial justice work. What's something about race that you've had to unlearn or relearn, or maybe that you've learned recently? So if you need to jot down that question, do that real quick. And then if we can go back to breakout sessions, the amount of time that we had on that first one seemed good to me. If it seemed good to everyone else or to the host, we can go with that same duration.
Perfect. I'll get this started.
Great. Doing the internal personal work is really important, not only because it will make a world where there are fewer microaggressions, where we can be a part in our everyday lives of creating a space that's more welcoming and inclusive to all. But it's also important because it makes it sustainable. If we don't see how our own fate, our own sense of freedom is wrapped up in the freedom, and when I say we, I'm clearly talking about white people. If I should say I, when I as a white person, if I don't see how my freedom isn't wrapped up with the freedom of my brothers and sisters of color, then I don't think that I can sustainably fight for racial justice. So I think it's really important to see myself in that struggle. And then there are tangible things. So we're talking about these two streams now. Stream number two, there are tangible ways that you can support and create policies that will create change. So I'm listing 5 here that I'm going to talk over, and I'm almost just going to read my slide, which I know you're not supposed to do, so I apologize for that. But I think the first and one of the easiest ways to support wealth building in communities of color is to be intentional with how you spend your money. So as we talked about, the history of real estate and banking in the United States has created an enormous wealth gap between white households and Black households. It's happened through government and private action working together. And I think it's a very simple way for us to make a dent in that wealth gap by being intentional where we spend our money. So looking for businesses owned by people of color as much as you can to spend your money there instead of at a white business will help to offset that wealth disparity. There are a few organizations that you can donate to financially who are also doing that work very specifically. KC Gift, that's Kansas City Generating Income for Tomorrow is what that stands for. As well as the Green Line Initiative are doing work specifically here in Kansas City to build wealth in the Black community. So KC Gift supports Black-owned businesses, and the Green Line Initiative assist with the remodeling of homes and building property ownership for Black families in Kansas City. Really cool organizations. I definitely recommend looking into them and donating to them. Then I know volunteership is really important to this group. Volunteering for organizations who are clamoring for justice through strategic action. Organizations like One Struggle KC, the Urban League, and More Squared. More Squared stands for the Metropolitan Organization for Racial and Economic Equity. All of those organizations are very strategic about using collective voices to get real policy change here in Kansas City. They're doing really awesome work. I definitely recommend following them, paying attention to what they're doing, and getting involved in their work as you're able. I think another one of the things that I would recommend that is maybe difficult in a different way, but it's really cool as far as a way that you can make tangible change in your workplace. So we all have workplaces or spheres of influences, organizations that we're a part of, and many times there are policies there that may not say anything about race, but that may have racially disparate impact. I'm going to give an example of this one because I think this is really important. And I apologize, it's not a Kansas City example. It's top of mind and just a really good example. So in New York, as recently as a couple of years ago, well, I should cite my source. Nice White Parents is a really great podcast that came from NPR, from Serial, and they were mentioning this. So New York public schools has a lottery system, much like we do in Kansas City for many of our schools. And one of the criteria for schools was niceness. When there is a criteria that is so vague and so subjective as niceness, it is a tremendous way for personal bias to make its way into the selection process. So again, like, niceness says nothing about race, but it's so subjective that when you live in a society where you have all this history that creates a difference based on race, that we all have racial bias sort of automatically because of where we live. And I don't mean Kansas City, I mean the whole country. So we can sort of search and destroy for policies like that that really allow bias to enter in. So that's an awesome way that you can make change. And then of course, we're so close to the election. If you haven't already voted, voting in local elections as well as presidential elections is really important as a way for you to use your voice to make policy change. Ibram Kendi, the scholar, he has a great book, Stamped from the Beginning, which is about the history of racist ideas. And he would say that it's racist policies. It's not changing. He would argue that it's not changing hearts that will stop racism. It's changing policies. I really think we got to do both. But he would argue that it's really only the policy change. So that's something we got to do. So this last breakout is maybe the most uncomfortable one, because I just like to sort of take it to task. Like we just talked through a list of 5 different things that you can do to make a real difference in fighting for a world that is more racially just. So I'd love to take, let's say, 5 minutes. Wait, 5, is that enough? Let's do 7 minutes again. Let's take 7 minutes and in groups talk about what's an action that you would commit to doing. And then we'll come back and just do a little bit of Q&A if there are any questions. Welcome back, all. So we were just in our breakout talking about what are some resources for locating businesses owned by people of color in Kansas City that you can support. So we're going to put, I think my good friend Amanda and I are going to put some of those in the chat. If anyone else knows organizations who have lists of places to buy black in Kansas City, you can put them there too. No, like Made in KC actually made a little list. I think there's an app from Black Privilege. If not, there will be soon. Okay, so I hope this has been meaningful. Again, just talking about how the landscape around us, it's there through great intentionality, and it's created a world where racial difference exists, and it sort of gets into our skin, and it's especially for white people really important to unlearn the things that we sort of learn automatically through our surroundings or through our history books, or through any number of ways that we learn to see the world. So I hope people will have taken something interesting from this and will take some action. I think we have a few minutes for questions. If anyone has questions for me, I always feel weird about doing questions. I'm like, I produce cool things. I don't feel like I have great answers otherwise, but if you have any questions, fire away. I really gave you a great incentive to ask questions, sorry.
I think this is Nikki Nix. Just not really a question, but more of an observation in one of our breakout groups. I think we just feel kind of sad at how little progress has been made, like in taking that tour. And when all of this happened, it just feels like not much has changed.
I think mourning is part of the process. I think it's important to feel that sadness, and again to think specifically about how it affects you, and then to find ways to move forward, because we've got to keep fighting. We've got to create that world that everybody has equal opportunity, truly. There was a great organization that was mentioned by Amanda Campbell, I think. KC Tenants, which is doing some really great work specifically in the real estate space. So much like Green Line Initiative, well, Green Line Initiative is also doing things in the real estate space to fight for justice. So is KC Tenants, but really fighting for tenant rights. And they've made some cool strides in the last couple of years with a tenants Bill of Rights that I think came out last year or the year before, that was approved by City Council. I'm not sure how much teeth that Bill of Rights has, but there are cool things happening, and people are fighting back.
Hi, Nathaniel. My name is Camille Briscoe. We took the tour yesterday, my family, and we really enjoyed it. I was curious, how does Kansas City compare to other cities you might have looked at in terms of not advancing much beyond the policies or development that was put in place so long ago? Is it similar to other cities, or a little bit behind, or not as bad?
I would say Kansas City is sort of a representative example. As far as let's see, I can say that as far as the history of Kansas City, it's a representative example. As far as the progress we've made, man, I don't know that I can answer that really well. I can certainly think of cities that have done more to improve, but I don't know the current state of enough cities to get a gauge on what the average is.
No, that's helpful. Thank you. Are there any recommendations you would have for then how Kansas City could improve?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are some really great policy recommendations that can go through. And again, Green Line Initiative is pushing on some of these. So I think one really specific example, I really think there should be property tax freezes in neighborhoods that have been historically redlined, specifically, not for everyone, but specifically for Black residents that live there now, or there needs to be some specificity in that legislation so that it doesn't become just a way to more easily gentrify those neighborhoods. But I think that the trouble with the way things are is that you can't have quote unquote race neutral policies going forward and expect that it'll create a sort of race neutral future. Because we have a history of racist idea and policy leading up to the present, we must have race conscious policy legislation going forward. One example of that would be, again, race conscious property tax freezes in neighborhoods that have been historically redlined, and the Green Line Initiative is working on that.
Thank you. That was very helpful.
Nathaniel, this is Christine. Would you mind going back to your slide with kind of the action points that you recommended? I just wanted to get a screenshot of that.
Oh yeah, you bet.
Thank you.
So I think some exciting, I didn't really have a way to work this in, but it came up in one of our breakout sessions. So if you took the Dividing Lines tour by driving around, that's awesome. And it's still going to be the preferred way to take it. But I'm really excited that I'm continuing to work with the Johnson County Library to create a virtual version of the tour. So in the next several months, so sometime early to mid next year, we will have a version of the tour which you can experience from the comfort of your couch through a 360-degree video that you can view in YouTube or eventually on a purpose-built website. And our hope is that this will broaden access to the tour and also allow access to the tour outside of Kansas City, or say for schools who can't afford the bus trip, or who are operating virtually. So we're really excited about that. Also working on a game to model the mechanics of segregation, and really to model that idea of public policy working together with private decisions that were the mechanics of segregation in the past and into the present. So I'm very excited about that game that we're working on as well. It's sort of intended for high schoolers, but I imagine it'll be meaningful for adults as well. So keep your ear out, I guess, for that. Keep an eye out for that. Any other thoughts or questions? Oops. All right, well, thanks all so much for being a good audience. It's so different doing this sitting in my home office and not being able to see you in person. Really, thanks for having me. Again, I hope this was useful. If anyone wants to talk more or comment more on anything, I'm very accessible through the internet.
Thanks so much, Nathaniel. I really appreciate it.
You bet.
Yeah, thank you.